I love making pieces that deal with social justice issues, and this particular piece deals with immigration and who is allowed to immigrate to this country. I made the quilt about 10 years ago, and it was at a time when many Haitian refugees, uh, actually boat people, were coming over to escape Haiti and the strife that they endured there. And these people, once they reached Florida, were immediately sent back. And the title of this quilt, Certain Restrictions Do Apply, and I believe they apply to each individual differently, depending upon where that person comes from. It's it's much easier for immigrants who are white to come here as opposed to immigrants that are Black. So this is my uh, position in this quilt, and the Statue of Liberty is holding a stop sign, and that stop sign is reflective of who the government tries to stop from entering the country. This quilt tells the story of um, Adrian Vlok, who was the Minister of Security in South Africa during apartheid. And it was on his watch that thousands of South African people were killed by the police. And after apartheid, when Nelson Mandela became president, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Council put together. Desmond Tutu, Bishop Desmond Tutu, was one of the founders of that group. Adrian Vlok contacted the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and told them that he wanted to come before the commission to confess and talk about his transgression against Black South Africans and seek their forgiveness. Adrian Vlok also said to show how sincere he was about coming before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he wanted to wash the feet of some of the mothers and wives that were killed on his watch as security minister. And I felt that this was a very poignant moment. I think the most humbling thing one human being can do for another is wash their feet. So I wanted to commemorate that foot washing in a quilt. And overlooking this entire event, you see Bishop Tutu, Desmond Tutu, overlooking the washing of the feet of the women. I used to make applique quilts. I love applique, but it's very time consuming because I would do it by hand. Later on, I did it by machine, but it's still time consuming. I don't want to spend a lot of time putting the quilt together. I think the graphics are the most important thing on the quilt, and it does not matter how you accomplish those graphics, whether you do it by applique painting or drawing or using the computer. It doesn't matter as long as you can do it. So drawing them out and having them printed on fabric is an easy way for me to get the quilt top done in a timely manner. I like gathering the ideas. That's important. I keep diaries and drawings, and I do a lot of writing about my ideas of what I want to show in my quilts, and that's very important to me. Um, because I like storytelling and using the storytelling for um, to talk about issues of social justice, it's very meaningful for me to write about it. Quilts can make a statement, or art can make a statement about difficult subjects, whereas people might not want to read about those difficult subjects, but you can render them in quilts. And hopefully, when people see them, it will make them think. Um, Visuals have power, just as words have power. So it's my hope that my quilts can inflict a change. Who knows? Every human being here in this country has a lifelong affair, relationship with cloth. It's the first thing we're swathed in at birth. It's the last thing to touch our bodies upon our death. So we cannot get away from the cloth. It's easy to tell stories using quilts because, especially quilts, most people are familiar with quilts and they see them as items of comfort, warmth. It reminds them of hearth and home. So it's a very familiar item that you're using to tell a story, sometimes very difficult stories, in my case, for social justice quilts. This quilt, My Brother's Keeper, is what I call a happy quilt because it deals with my grandchildren. These are my two eldest grandchildren, and the oldest always finds, well, he deems himself the keeper of his brother. Little brother is very mischievous and always getting into so many things, and always the eldest brother's looking out for him. So in this piece, I try and depict uh, the care that this older brother has for his young sibling. In all of my quilts, there are these concentric circles, and they're symbolic of the life cycle. Life is continuous. Also, most of the quilts have a patchwork border, and it's my way of paying tribute to the quilters that have come before me. My quilts derive from my thoughts. I have to think about it and think about the subject matter, think about the topics, think about what I want to say, and write. I do a lot of writing. It might be months, sometimes years, before I get the subject down firmly that I want to execute in a quilt. I don't plan. I don't plan anything. I just fly by the seat of my pants, and whatever happens, happens. And especially since I'm a self-taught quilter, and over the past 50 years, I've been quilting. I keep saying I'm going to take some classes, but I've never had time to take classes. So I have to figure out things for myself, and it's very much intuitive. As I said, whatever happens as I go along the process happens. The quilt talks to you, and it lets you know when things are done. You know, I don't put any time limit on finishing a quilt. I work on it until that quilt says, okay, enough is enough. And it lets you know when everything is done. You can see it, and you can feel it. And it's intuitive. It's an intuitive process, very much so. Initially, when I started quilting, I made traditional patchwork quilts and then graduated from that to applique quilts. And over the years, I became more so interested in issues of social justice and history, African American history, and made a decision that all of my quilts would deal with that subject matter. And I find the older that I get, the more interested I become in what's happening around me and what affects my family and the people that I care about and what is happening within my own culture. There is more of a need to make quilts about what's happening around me. I often say that quilts are like documents. They're no less historic documents. We have people at universities around the world that study quilts. Hundreds of years from now, people will be looking at the quilts that I make and other quilt makers make, and they look at my quilts and they get a glimpse of what's happening in the African American community, what's happening in my family, what's happening in the United States during the time that I made that quilt. So each quilt is a historic document that's in itself a time capsule. As a curator, I'm not curating for technique. Technique doesn't matter to me. I'm curating for story. I want a strong storyline. And as long as the quilt doesn't fall apart during the tour of the show, I'm happy. But I'm looking for storyline, a strong storyline. And then the same in my own quilts that will make a viewer stop and look at that quilt and absorb the story. I'm not looking for cute. I'm looking for a strong story that will touch people's spirit, that will touch their hearts and engage their minds. And I love it. I love it when I have that kind of quilts. Some quilts are just so deep in storyline. They have their own pulse point, their own heartbeat. And that's a very emotional thing. And when the viewer looks at that quilt and absorbs that story, then I feel my job as curator is done. The artist's job is done. If I made that quilt, my job is done as a maker because I touch the spirit of the viewer. Art is important because it enables the creation of art enables me as an artist to touch the heart, mind, and spirit of the viewer. And that's the purpose of creating it. The Peacekeeper's gifts deal with a situation where the United Nations has sent peacekeepers out to Haiti and countries in West Africa. And these men, when they're there as peacekeepers, they have raped young men and women, children really, that they're put there to care for. As a result, in many African villages, you see mixed race children, the children of these soldiers, and they're ostracized in the villages that they live in. And the girls can no longer go to school. They're taking care of the children. And of course, the peacekeepers come and go, but these children are left behind. And this has been a problem that's brought before the United Nations constantly for the past 30 years. And little to this day has been done about that. So children are a gift. They come here innocent. So hence the title, The Peacekeeper's Gift. So although their life is difficult in their villages, still they're a gift from God. This actually started out as a black and white quilt. And there were problems with the ink that was used in this. So the quilt is heavily quilted and I didn't want to lose the quilt. So I colored over the entire quilt and with textile paint and acrylic paint. And I like the results. I might do other painted quilts. So it's a painted quilt by accident. And you asked me about the flowers. They're there because I just love flowers. I can't grow them, but I can paint them in my work. During the pandemic, I could not see my grandchildren. And my eldest son has identical twin girls. I didn't see them for a year and a quarter because of the COVID virus. Whereas I couldn't see them, I could quilt their images. So hence this quilt. Their mother sent me their first day at preschool, and it just happened to be a rainy day. And I wanted to commemorate that first day of school. And as a young child, and still to this day, I love walking in the rain. So this quilt is about pleasant memories about my grandchildren. Again, you see the circles in the quilt, and I just thought I would add a dash of color and give them yellow boots. And for whatever reason, as a child, I remember I had yellow rain boots and I love the color yellow. So I gave them these yellow rain boots, and I think it really pops on the black and white. So surrounding this quilt, there are images of cowrie shells. And of course, in West Africa, cowrie shells were used as a form of money, but also they're seen as good luck charms. So I wanted to surround them with cowrie shells for good luck in life. And that's that quilt. I collect quilts among other stuff. I have hundreds of quilts. The entire collection of my works deal mainly with African American history, social justice issues. Most of the quilts are made by African American men and women. However, there are some quilts that are made by white people. However, the story has an African American connection. It somehow ties into with African American history. So that's the bulk of the collection. Well, first of all, I love art. Um, I feel that not only the artwork I create, but the artwork I own is part of my legacy. This art is what I leave to my children and grandchildren, um, especially because the works pertain to African American history. That's important to me. My family has to have a piece of that history. My family has to have a piece of me. So um, these works I leave my family. There are portions of them that will be in institutions, but the bulk of it goes to my family. The Women of Color Quilters Network is an organization I founded almost 40 years ago, and it was founded to preserve, educate, document, and present African American made quilts. At one point, we had over 1,500 members, and over the past 40 years, many of those members have passed away. But we continue with the membership that we have to present quilts and make quilts. And I'm very happy about that because we've shown all over the world at some of the world's most prominent museums. The artists that are in the shows are very creative, but also at the same time, we as African American artists are a very small percentage. We are a fraction of 1% of the quilt community in the United States. So it's not that many of us. It's not that many of us. It's not that many African American quilters that are even willing to sell their work, because for the most part, I would say 99% of the artists in the Women of Color Quilters Network, they're hobbyists. They make their quilts for themselves and their families and their friends. They don't give a hoot whether you ever see the quilts. Curating a show of African American quilts is very difficult because the artist had no intent to show his or her quilts. That was not why they were made. So back to your question, I think the quilts sell well because of, again, the creativity, stories that the artists have to tell, and the scarcity. All artists should talk about their work and talk especially about the work that they've created. And this way, it's not held up to interpretation by anyone. The artist has told a factual story that can be written about. When the artwork is shown, it can be on the text panels, but that artwork speaks the truth through the voice of the artist. And to me, that's important. It's important because so much of the early work by African Americans was interpreted by scholars and not the artist. The artist had no voice. The artist has to have a voice because they're the creators of the work, not the scholars, not the critics. And they have the last word because they have the true word. It's their voice. And you should not take away anyone's voice. I find it fascinating how critics and scholars interpret artist works when that was not the original intent of the artist. And these interpretations are printed. So oftentimes they're printed without any input from the maker. Well, it's unethical, and it does a big disservice to the artist. And it's an even bigger disservice to history. Well, I've been given a lot of advice. So I don't know. I'm trying to think the best advice. I had a friend early on, 40 years ago, who was in the American Embroiderers Guild, and she was also a quilt maker. And she always said, let your spirit be free and do what you want to do and not what someone else wants you to do insofar as your artwork. And that's very true. I hold that true today. And I tell other artists that do what you want to do. There's no formula for, well, there's no formula that should be used, the creation of art. It should be whatever the artist wants. I don't believe in making quilts just to satisfy an audience. That's not why I make quilts. I make them because I find value and appreciation in the subject. I do them for me first. And if I'm lucky enough and fortunate enough that a collector or buyer likes what I've created, then that's a good thing. And if they don't, that's a good thing too, because I like it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it. So, and I guess that's the first issue. I quilt for me. And all of the members of WCQN do the same thing. We quilt for ourselves, no one else. So we have to satisfy ourselves. I think that's a wonderful thing. It's very gratifying. It's very gratifying to make something that we ourselves appreciate. So I'm my number one fan. I'm so happy now for this moment in history because quilts are catching on with collectors. And now there's one former network member, Bisa Butler's work. It's just it's just outstanding. And she's so prolific. And she's really made a change in the way museums see quilts. This one contemporary artist has made that difference, and it's a leap from the traditional view of quilts, and to have museums of contemporary art show exhibitions of quilts is a huge leap. And that's never been done before, ever, where you have a contemporary art museum feature quilts. So she's changing history. She's making history, changing the way that quilts are seen. And you have more and more museums purchasing quilts. You have more important collectors purchasing quilts, and that calls attention to the quilt community and what the community is doing. So all of this it's good.